Hello, welcome everyone. It's Michelle Fanuff and Gary Armstrong here with Workplace Fairness. We're just sharing some information today around trust in the workplace. And Workplace Fairness is a Canadian organization that supports employees and other organizations to build a strong, healthy workplaces, psychologically safe workplaces. So, Gary, do you want to just introduce yourself a bit?
Sure. I'm Gary Armstrong. I'm a colleague of Michelle's. We've been working together through um, Workplace Fairness West for about 2 years now, but our work relationships extends back to time together mediating with the Alberta Provincial Courts on civil mediation disputes. And so both of us have a pretty substantial background in involving ourselves in I need to be careful how I say it. Involving ourselves in the conflict of others or helping others through their conflict, I guess.
Yeah, we're not creating the conflict. We're trying to support others to resolve that. So
That's right.
we have strong conflict resolution backgrounds, coaching backgrounds, and yeah, want to just step in today to talk a bit about trust in the workplace. So let us start. So I have some thoughts on this, Gary, kind of what's important about trust in the workplace. Do you want me to start, or I'd like to hear what you have to say too.
Yeah, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, for me, I think, and in my work in conflict, and as you know, Gary, that trust is a very important indicator, I think, of psychological health and safety. So when trust is low, or there's low trust in the organization, or there's broken working relationships, then that starts impacting people's psychological health and doesn't allow us to really bring our best selves to work. So I think when we're in a strong, healthy, trusting working relationships and within an organization where trust abounds, that people can bring their best selves and create good, strong teams too, good teamwork.
Yeah, trust is so important. I was just on the internet this morning looking for some things, and I came across some stuff from engineering, and you'll know this from your background, Michelle. The idea of stress and strain. And I mean, it's a concept that's evident in engineering, but I think it's also a concept that's evident in life. And there's a little bit of stress, there's a tension around conflict that at times can be very, very healthy. It promotes conversation and it pushes people to be curious. But when things get strained, then it's to the point, or can get to the point, where it goes beyond strained and then actually fractures, and then the trust isn't there. And so it's something that we need, that tension, but at the same time, things work so much better when it stays in just being a bit stressful.
Yeah, and we're going to talk more about the impact of trust in conflict, and just the impact of trust in general, and how to build that trust. So let's first look at, because our brains like to think about the negative of that, like kind of these stages of distrust, and what happens when trust is broken. And I think we start out, and like you said in that conflict example, having a little bit of doubt, and then if trust isn't repaired, that becomes suspicion. If that keeps going, it becomes anxiety, fear. And then as we often see in the workplace, because we come into high conflict situations, that people are about self-protection, right? Mm-hmm. The level of distrust is so high that all they can think about is how they can protect themselves.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that initial one, the doubt, it helps when I recognize that. It helps me to then say, okay, now's the time to get curious. Right? If I get curious right at the very start of those stressful situations, it doesn't as often get to the place where it's strained that I get into self-protection.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah, because when you're at the self-protection level, it's very difficult to go back and rebuild trust.
Yeah.
But if you're at that doubt part, then yeah, let's take those steps. And not to say it can't happen, because I have seen it happen
Mhm.
at that, more extreme level, but it takes longer, and it there's lots of little baby steps involved in that, for sure.
Right.
Okay, so just, a bit of self-reflection for people, I think, around, do people trust you at work? And let's start with what we can control, and what our own trustworthiness is. And, just some questions around, are your own actions causing people not to trust you, right? Do you overpromise, fail to deliver, take credit for other people's work, gossip about others in the workplace? And the impact of our own behaviors, and how we might be coming across, the impact of that with credibility and reliability in the eyes of others.
I recall being at a retirement event for a fellow that had finished off 35 years in the career, and he was heading off to retirement. And of course, people would get up and say things about him. And one of the comments that just seemed to continue through pretty much everybody was that this individual had never spoken a bad word about anyone else at work. And that didn't mean that he didn't maybe have bad words that he could speak, but he made the choice not to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And people respected him for that.
Yeah, and people had a lot of trust in him, I'm sure.
Absolutely, they did, yeah.
Okay, well, let's just look at some different models, I think, around trust. There's different ways of looking at it, and I've added a few in here just so we could have a bit of a discussion around it. The first one was referenced at a TED Talk by Frances Frey at the Harvard. She's a Harvard Business School professor, and she talked about this triangle of these kind of three sides of trust. And I like to think of it as a three-legged stool, right? Because she talked about kind of where do you wobble if these three pieces might not be even, or might be missing these three pieces around authenticity, empathy, and logic. And so authenticity being, when you're coming into conversations, are you authentic? Are you bringing your real thoughts and your real self to this conversation? Empathy, right? Do we care about where others are at and what they might be experiencing? And the logic is about being able to communicate your thoughts effectively, and that, there's some logic to your argument, or your theory, or whatever that is that you're bringing forward. So being able to communicate that succinctly, and have it be thoughts, Gary, from you, as the value of this triangle here of looking at trust in that way.
Uh, when I look at it, I look at it and I see um, a lot of responsibility on me. Right? I need to be logical. I need to be authentic. I need to be empathetic, and I need to recognize that our relationship is best served when I do those things. If I step away from being logical and step into the emotional judgments that I've made based on what I have seen, right? What I have seen is the logical piece. The judgments that I make would be quite often me stepping into being illogical, right? The authentic piece is to recognize, here's what I've seen, here's how it's impacting me, here's how I feel, and at the same time be empathetic and understand that the other side probably didn't mean it the way that I've interpreted and we did a talk earlier in regards to the narrative, the story that I tell myself. I'm best served when I tell myself the other person is working to be trustworthy.
Mm-hmm. And coming from a good intention. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Here's another great little graphic I found around the elements of trust, or they call it the distinctions of trust.
Mhm.
And, you know, I just thought it was very simply laid out around these four elements around sincerity, reliability, competence, and care. And again, looking at these, you know, four pieces, and if one's missing, then that impacts how trustworthy we we come across, or we're able to be, right? And a lot of this ties into um, that previous picture around sincerity, care, right? In authenticity, empathy, and that logical piece, I think, ties to reliability and competence, right? So competence, do you have the ability to do what you've said you were going to do or propose to do? Um, Reliability, can you meet those commitments? Can you keep your promises? So yeah, I just really was drawn to this little drawing. It just made so much sense in such a simple form.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's another example of, you know, it may look simple, right?
Yeah.
It may be common sense, and we trip, and it's not always my common practice.
We do trip, and we're going to talk a bit more about that further on, about being able to recognize that and what impact that has on trust.
Yeah.
So I know you're a fan of Stephen Covey, Gary, so I'll let you talk a bit about how Stephen Covey looks at trust, and his book, The Speed of Trust.
Yeah. So if you look off on the right side of this graphic, the roots of things, and how it's identified as character. And character is a person's ability to work from a place of integrity, and being integrous is the action of that. And so that means that when I'm asked for my opinion, I give my opinion. I may be cautious in the words that I choose, in order to keep emotions down. But if I'm upset about something, I'll say I'm upset. I won't say, oh no, everything's fine. I have a friend who says fine never means fine, and they actually outlawed that in their in their family. And so to push each other to just be integrous. That doesn't mean that I have to be blunt and direct, but then it also doesn't excuse me when I am overly blunt and overly direct. And a person of character acts with integrity and with the thoughts and emotions of the recipient in mind. And so always from a place of positive intent, and putting the information out in a way that the other side is going to be open to accessing it. There's a scene in a movie, I can't think of the movie now, but there's the female actress, it's Cher, and she reaches out and she slaps somebody across the face and says, snap out of it. That does nothing for building a relationship of trust. And we see too much of that, in my opinion, in popular culture. There's this mistaken notion that if I just pound my fist on a table or I become more powerful, then the other one is going to acquiesce. And as soon as it moves into that power struggle, then the trust starts to erode and evaporate. Mm-hmm. So I have to become very, very capable and very competent in my communication with people, and the language that I choose, and the thoughts that I convey, and always being truthful. It's a lot harder than it might look. But if I want the results of a good, strong, trusting relationship, I think most everybody can sit back and say, you know, there's one person, maybe two in the whole world that I would trust with anything. That's not very many.
Yeah, because of all these different levels of trust, right? And do people meet these parameters that we need to build this high level of trust? And I know too, this is a good depiction of Stephen Covey's understanding of trust in a more concrete way, I guess,
Mhm.
and more detailed way of looking at these pillars, right, around character, competence, uh, intent, integrity, capability, results, which really ties with that earlier um, image that we had. So yeah, I think there's a lot involved. So when you say it's, it sounds simple, but it's not easy, right? Because it's really all encompassing in our actions and what we say and do.
Yeah. And it's interesting, the comment will get made, well, he doesn't trust me.
Mm.
Um, and then if the question is asked, well, how do you feel about him? Well, I don't trust him. And so then the next question I like to ask is, okay, we're pretty clear on what his contribution is to this relationship eroding. What has been yours? And much like the earlier video that we've done, the whole idea of I'm never the villain. I may never be the villain, but I'm never without contribution. And so that other, if they don't trust me, they've seen something in me that they don't, that gives rise to that.
Mm.
And
Yeah, and we talked earlier, Gary, about why trust is important, and I think for an organization as a whole, it's very important in creating trust from the leadership down. But we can't always, I guess, control that within our own organizations. I think we have to focus on what we can do and how we can build trust in ourselves and in our immediate work environment with our colleagues. And so let's think about that and be able to focus on that a bit. And I wanted to share a few thoughts that I'm going to wrap up in the resources around how we can build trust. Where I found this, I'll share it in the resources. So maybe you just want to start with the first few really quickly, Gary, and then I can go through the last few.
yeah. So in the initial round, just to establish that relationship and get the building of trust started, right? I have to tell the truth. I have to admit when I don't know something, which is that integrous piece. I have to admit when I'm wrong, and that takes some vulnerability on my part. I have to, if I say I'm going to do something, I have to do it. If I'm meant to do it, then I do it, and it can help a lot to just simply explain my thought process. I've seen a lot of things cleared up just by somebody saying, well, this is what I was thinking when I was doing this.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that really ties to me to that first triangle around logic, right? Explain your thought process, and I can see how these tie into all these different pillars that Stephen Covey has, and the different images that we looked at. And so just to continue on, extending trust to others is important too. We have to think about that, think about including others, whether that be in our conversations in the workplace or the work that we're doing. Watching our own reactions, having that self-awareness, giving others a chance to talk. I think that's really tied to include others. Listen with intent and take that time to listen. Don't always be the one talking. And take appropriate responsibility for failures, which ties into 2 and 3 very closely, right? So if something goes wrong, you don't have to take all the responsibility if you don't feel that it's all your responsibility, but at least take that responsibility for which you can, and that which is appropriate. So I came across this Gary, and I thought it would resonate with you and likely others around this emotional bank account. Just quick thoughts before we wrap up on how this might resonate with you or others
For me, I've come to understand, I've come to appreciate that trust is built incrementally. Trust is built when somebody is courageous enough to start, right? And quite often I gain that courage by working to understand where the other side is coming from, working to try and show that kindness, that courtesy, that respect of just listening to what, as we've talked about, what their narrative is, what their story is. How is it that they come to those thoughts, those conclusions? I have to work to keep my promises and be loyal. There's in the use of influence, there's always an expense when I expend to be influential. And it shows up more, I guess, when people start to talk about relationships of power. And when I do that, there's sort of this withdrawal from my bank account of trust. And so if I assume that I understand, well, then I'm actually taking money out of that bank account. And if I show unkindness, I'm taking money out of the trust bank account that I worked hard to build. And so I need to be very, very careful and very mindful of where I spend my dollars. It doesn't do our relationship any good if I pound my fist on the table, stand up and start shouting at somebody in a boardroom meeting. But any level of trust that I've worked hard to gain, well, I've just spent a whole bunch of it. And so any of the things that are in the withdrawals column, if I engage in those behaviors, then I really need to recognize that it's taking money out of the trust bank account.
Yeah, and to think about when we might be overdrawn, right?
Yeah. Well, and we usually find out we're overdrawn in a bad way. So.
Yeah, exactly. So just to recap, these are some of the resources we're referring to within our conversation earlier. So check those out if you have time. And so I just want to thank people for taking part today and joining us. Check out our other videos that we have online. And thanks to you, Gary, for your wisdom today and adding to the conversation. I really appreciate it.
Always happy to have a conversation, Michelle. Okay. Always.
Let's do more.
Okay.
Take care.
Thank you.